In the third week of November 1987, in the basement storeroom of the Manchester Central Library, a preservation archivist named Patricia Cleeve opened a mislabeled tin box. It had been catalogued simply as Miscellaneous Correspondence, 1890 to 1895. The label was typed on a card worn thin at the edges, the ink rubbed to near invisibility by decades of handling. Outside, rain drove hard against the grills that covered the narrow windows near the ceiling, the windows that sat inexplicably at the level of the pavement above. Cleeve noticed the grills before she noticed the box. She had noticed them every morning for 11 years. She had never thought to ask why they were there. That morning, for reasons she would later struggle to explain, she finally did. The sole answer, buried in the tin box she held in her hands, would turn out to be older, stranger, and more deliberate than anyone at the library had anticipated. The box contained 43 letters. Most were routine, but near the bottom, folded 4 times and sealed with a wax impression that had cracked but not crumbled, was a letter dated the 14th of March, 1892. It was from the office of the city librarian to the architectural firm of Potts, Son, and Hennings. The letter referred to something called the lower provision. It mentioned ventilation, humidity ratios, and a phrase that stopped Cleeve cold: the insulation of the scholarly mind from the perturbations of the street. The phrase was underlined, not printed in the letter. Time equals, quote, 300 milliseconds, quote / greater, then underlined by hand in a different pen by someone who had read the letter after it was written. That someone left no name. This is not a story about one library. It is a story about a decision that was made across dozens of cities and more than a century, with a consistency too precise to be coincidence, and a reasoning that the official record has never fully explained. Stand on the pavement outside any major Victorian public library built between 1850 and 1910 and look down. In most of them, below the grand entrance steps, below the iron railings, below the decorative stone plinths, there is a row of windows. They sit just above the ground. In some buildings, they are barred with ornate ironwork. In others, they are half buried under accumulated grime and old paint. Occasionally, they have been bricked in entirely, but the spaces behind them are almost always still there, still in use, still serving the same essential function they were designed to serve. They are the reading rooms, and they were put there on purpose. By the autumn of 1850, in Birmingham, the debate about public libraries had acquired a particular urgency. The Public Libraries Act had passed in that same year, a landmark piece of legislation that permitted local councils to levy a halfpenny rate to fund free public libraries. The vote had been narrow. The arguments against were loud and specific: that working men could not be trusted with books. Time equals, quote, 350 milliseconds, quote / greater than, that the idle poor would abuse the resource, that the expense could not be justified. But beneath those political arguments ran a quieter, stranger anxiety. It appeared in committee minutes, in private correspondence between councillors and municipal architects, in the personal journals of men who shaped early Victorian civic culture. The anxiety was this: that reading, true reading, the kind of deep cognitive immersion that transforms the mind, cannot happen in proximity to the street. On the 22nd of October, 1852, in the offices of Henry Chamberlain, Birmingham's principal civic architect, a memorandum was circulated among the design committee for the new reference library on Union Street. Chamberlain's notes specify that the reading room must be, in his own words, removed from the influence of exterior noise, vibration, and the thermal irregularity of exposed facades. The document is 3 pages long. The 3rd page contains a table of measurements: ceiling heights, wall thicknesses, distances below grade. The table is crossed through with a single diagonal line, and beside it, in a cramped hand, someone has written, "Revised. See the Merthyr arrangement." No document labeled the Merthyr arrangement has ever been found. What Chamberlain built was a reading room 12 feet below street level. He gave no public explanation for this. The building's opening brochure, printed in 1865, described the lower floor simply as the principal room for study. No mention of why it was principal. No mention of why it was below. The choice to position reading rooms underground was not unique to Birmingham. Between 1852 and 1905, at least 63 major public libraries were constructed in England, Scotland, and Wales. Of those, 41 placed their primary reading rooms either fully below street level or sufficiently sunken that natural light entered only through high clerestory windows or pavement-level grilles. The pattern held regardless of the architect, regardless of the municipality, regardless of the stated budget. Something in the Victorian understanding of what a reading room needed to be kept, pulling these spaces downward. On the 7th of June, 1869, in Liverpool, the city's new William Browne Library opened to the public. Time equals 400 milliseconds / greater than. The ceremony was reported at length in the Liverpool Mercury. The Lord Mayor spoke, a brass band performed, dignitaries toured the upper galleries, but the Mercury correspondent, a man named Josiah Firth, devoted the longest passage of his report not to the galleries or the collections, but to the reading room in the lower level. He sat there for a quarter of an hour alone after the ceremony had ended. He described the room as possessing a quality of silence unlike that found in any room above ground. A silence that was not merely the absence of sound, but a positive condition, a presence, as though the earth itself were pressing quiet through the walls. Firth was not a man given to poetic excess. His other dispatches that month concerned sewage improvements and a dispute over railway freight tariffs. Whatever he felt in that room, it was specific enough to move him to metaphor. The sensation Firth described was real. It had a physical cause. Victorian engineers and architects understood, with varying degrees of precision, the acoustic properties of mass. Stone and earth absorb sound. The deeper a room sits below the surface, the more of both surround it. A reading room 12 feet below street level is insulated from the noise of iron-shod hooves on cobblestones, from the vibration of passing omnibuses, from the distant percussion of construction, from the constant low-frequency rumble that permeated every Victorian city. In a period before soundproofing was a formal discipline, burial in the earth was the most effective available technology for creating acoustic calm. But the architects who designed these spaces understood something further. They recorded it intermittently, obliquely, in professional correspondence and private notes, and it went beyond simple noise reduction. On the 19th of March, 1878, in London, the architect John Oldrid Scott wrote a letter to the Metropolitan Board of Works regarding a proposed branch library in Southwark. In it, Scott argued against placing the reading room at ground level, because, as he wrote, the reader seated at grade is subject to distraction by movement perceived through glass and through vibration underfoot, which acts upon the nervous system, he continued. Level equals, quote, moderate, quote, greater than below the threshold of conscious attention. Scott was describing, with some precision, a phenomenon that cognitive scientists would not formally identify for another 100 years. The way peripheral movement and low-frequency vibration degrade sustained attention, even when a person is not consciously aware of them. Victorian architects could not have known the neuroscience, but they had observed the effect. They had watched reading rooms fail when they were built at street level, watched patrons fidget, lose focus, abandon their books early. They had watched underground rooms succeed. They drew the conclusion that was available to them, that the street, as a force, was hostile to thought, and that the solution was physical, separation, not from people, but from the restless energies of the city above. The thermal argument mattered too. By the winter of 1881, in Edinburgh, the Carnegie-funded Central Library project was in its early planning stages. Correspondence between the library committee and the architect George Washington Browne records a specific anxiety about temperature consistency. Browne's notes from December of that year refer to the volatility of rooms exposed to north and east aspects, and specify that the main reading room must maintain, in his words, a climate as even as a cellar. Cellars maintain even temperatures because they are insulated by the surrounding earth. A room buried below street level stays cooler in summer, warmer in winter, and more consistent throughout the day than any room at grade. For libraries, where the preservation of paper and ink was a genuine concern, this consistency was not a luxury, it was a preservation strategy. The readers benefited incidentally. On the 14th of April, 1886, the Edinburgh Central Library Committee received a report from Browne that included a cross-section drawing of the proposed building. The reading room sits in the lower level, clearly below grade. Beside it, in pencil, Browne had sketched a notation. Arrows indicating air movement through the ventilation shafts. Grill positions at pavement level. the depth of the surrounding soil. The drawing is precise. It is the drawing of someone who understood what the earth could do that a building alone could not. The notation also included, in the margin, a reference to the Liverpool model, confirming that architects in this period were not independently arriving at the same solution. They were sharing it. They were referencing each other. The sunken reading room was a professional consensus, passed between firms by letter and by visit, refined with each new commission. The social dimension was more carefully concealed. It appears in committee minutes rarely, and when it does, in language that requires interpretation. On the 3rd of November, 1883, in Manchester, a meeting of the Free Library Committee included a discussion of patron behavior in the newly opened Hume branch. A counselor named Thomas Worthington raised a concern about readers who entered the library not to read, but to shelter from the cold, to sleep, or simply to sit. He proposed measures for their removal. The librarian on duty, a woman named Agnes Pilkington, had opposed the measures. Her attendance at the meeting was noted. Her remarks were not recorded in the minutes. What followed was a compromise that appeared in the subsequent architectural brief for 2 new branch libraries. The reading rooms were to be positioned below the entrance level, accessible only by descending a staircase from the main hall. The staircase was, in itself, a filter. A person seeking shelter from the cold would enter the warm ground floor hall and find relief there. To access the reading room, one had to descend. Time equals 400 milliseconds / greater than to commit physically to going deeper. The descent was not a barrier in any legal or official sense. Anyone could take the stairs. But the descent changed the nature of the act. It required intention. It transformed casual entry into deliberate purpose. The architects of the Victorian Public Library were engineering behavior through space, long before behavioral economics had a vocabulary to describe what they were doing. There is a third reason, less practical than the others, that almost never appears in official documents. It surfaces instead in literary accounts, in memoirs, in the private journals of habitual library users from the period. On the 29th of August, 1902, in London, a young scholar named Edmund Gosse wrote in his diary of visiting the reading room of a Wandsworth branch library. He descended the stairs, took a seat at a long oak table under the electric light, and wrote, "There is a quality to underground rooms that city rooms do not possess. One is not merely removed from the street. One is removed from time. The hour above is unknowable. The weather is irrelevant. Only the page exists." Gosse articulated what the architects had constructed, a condition of temporal isolation, without the movement of shadows across a wall, without the audible clues of weather changing, without the visual information of passers-by. The reader loses track of the world's clock. The reader enters what cognitive researchers today would recognize as a state of deep flow, sustained concentration in which external time ceases to register. This was not an accidental byproduct. By 1902, librarians understood it, even if they lacked the terminology. The annual report of the Manchester Free Libraries for that year includes a statistical table comparing borrowing rates and average time on premises across several branches. The Hume branch, with its sunken reading room, showed average patron visits of 2 hours and 17 minutes. The Ancoats branch, whose reading room was at street level with large windows facing a busy junction, showed an average of 43 minutes. No analysis was offered in the report. The numbers were presented without comment, but someone had compiled them. Someone had compared them. In the closing years of the 19th century, as electricity replaced gas and buildings grew taller and more technically ambitious, the sunken reading room might have been abandoned as an architectural convention, superseded by better soundproofing, better climate control, better artificial lighting. It was not. The convention persisted well into the Edwardian period and, in modified form, into the 20th century. On the 11th of March, 1907, in Leeds, the Carnegie Library in Headingley opened its lower reading room with electric strip lighting and a mechanical ventilation system. The room was 14 feet below grade. The architect, Percy Robinson, was asked by a reporter from the Yorkshire Evening Post why the reading room was positioned so low. When the technology now existed, the reporter pressed, to create a suitable room at any level of the building. Robinson's answer was recorded in the Post's edition of the following day. He said, "Because we know it works, not because regulations required it, not because the site demanded it, not because of cost, because the accumulated experience of 50 years of public library design had produced a professional certainty that the underground reading room functioned better as a reading room than any alternative. The certainty was empirical. It was also, by 1907, largely unexamined. It had passed from deliberate choice into inherited convention, the way many effective practices do, reproduced because it worked, its original reasoning forgotten, its physical logic intact. On the 22nd of September, 2019, a doctoral student in urban history at the University of Sheffield named Mara Lindenfeld descended the stairs of the Central Library on Surrey Street and paused on the landing. She had been researching Victorian civic architecture for 3 years. She had read Chamberlain's memos, Scott's letter to the Metropolitan Board, Browne's cross-section drawings. She understood, intellectually, every reason why the reading room was where it was. The acoustics, the thermal logic, the behavioral engineering, the temporal, isolation. And yet, pausing on the landing, she experienced exactly what Edmund Gosse had described in 1902. The sense of leaving one world and entering another. The street sounds faded, the light changed, the temperature steadied. She descended the remaining steps and sat at a table identical in proportion, if not in material, to the one Gosse had described. She opened her laptop. She worked for 4 hours without once looking up. Today, the open-plan office, the dominant environment of contemporary knowledge work, is understood to be acoustically destructive, thermally inconsistent, and chronologically disorienting in ways that impair sustained concentration. The research is substantial, the findings consistent. Time equals 650 milliseconds / greater than noise degrades cognitive performance. Temperature fluctuation disrupts focus. The visual presence of moving colleagues draws the eye involuntarily, below the threshold of conscious attention, precisely as John Oldrid Scott described in 1878. Contemporary workplace designers respond with acoustic panels, dedicated focus rooms, and ambient lighting systems intended to create a stable, calm environment for deep work. The terminology is new, the problem is unchanged. Some of the most expensively designed corporate campuses in existence have built, at their centers, quiet rooms positioned below grade, insulated from the noise and visual disturbance of the floors above. They describe these spaces using the language of wellness, architecture, of biophilic design, of evidence-based workplace strategy. The firms that design them publish white papers with titles like Restorative Environments and Cognitive Performance. The white papers cite neuroscience research from the 1990s and 2000s, as though this represented the discovery of something new. In 1892, Henry Chamberlain's assistant wrote the insulation of the scholarly mind from the perturbations of the street, underlined it, and filed it in a tin box that sat untouched for 95 years. The grills in the ceiling of the Manchester Central Library reading room still admit a thin column of gray northern light each morning. Feet pass over them on the pavement above. The feet of commuters, shoppers, school children, people moving at the pace of the contemporary city. Below, in the reading room, the sound of those feet does not arrive. The room is insulated. The room is steady. The room is what the Victorians understood, without exactly knowing why they understood it, that a reading room needed to be, what the ledger called the lower provision, what the architects called the principal room, what Gosse called the place where only the page exists. All of these were the same insight, expressed in different vocabularies across different decades. That the conditions required for sustained human thought are not the natural conditions of civic life. They must be constructed. They must be deliberately arranged. They must be, in some fundamental sense, underground. The pavement-level grills let in light but keep the world at a distance. They were placed there by people who had noticed something, tested something, and built something that worked. Whether they would recognize their solution in the language of today's wellness architects is uncertain. Whether today's wellness architects know they are building the same rooms, in the same direction, for the same reason, is a question that the official record, as usual, does not answer. Patricia Cleeve retired from the Manchester Central Library in 2001. In her retirement, she gave one recorded interview to a local history journal in which she mentioned the tin box and the letter with its underlined phrase. She was asked whether she had ever found the document referred to as the Merthyr arrangement. She said she had not. She said she had looked. She described descending to the archive level on many mornings over the following years, searching the uncatalogued holdings in the back storeroom, behind the metal shelving. In the section marked Pre-Acquisition, Miscellaneous, she never found it. The back storeroom of the Manchester Central Library archive is 14 feet below street level. The grilles in the ceiling admit a thin band of morning light. In the silence of that room, with the city moving overhead and the world at a precise and functional distance, it is still possible to sit and open a box and find something that reorders the way the present looks at the past. Time equals 650 milliseconds / greater than that possibility remains. The archive, like the reading room above it, was designed to make it so.